Hello, my name is Rob Sanders, and I am giving a talk on the existence of God, a personal testimony. And I'm doing this because I think the existence of God is a great and important question. And I've looked into it over the years to a fair amount, and I've read about it, and I actually saw a video one time between a debate between Christopher Hitchens and Alistair McGrath. And the more I read about it, the less convinced I am that people are taking the right approach to this. And so I thought I would share my thoughts on this. Now, it's a personal testimony because I think that reading books is a great thing. And I've read a lot of books in my life. Actually, I've got many years of grad study, 13 or 14 years of graduate study, 3 advanced degrees, 2 master's degrees, PhD, systematic theology. And I also did everything but write a dissertation for a PhD in theoretical mathematics. So I'm in favor of an intellectual approach. I'm in favor of doing some serious thinking. But at the same time, as you will see, I don't think thinking is all there is to the matter. I think experience and life and living have a lot to do with the existence of God. So this is a personal testimony because I've lived the issue of the existence of God and also the goodness of God. And this is not only about, does God exist? It's also about, is there such a thing as heaven or hell? Now, when I say heaven or hell, I'm not talking about heaven and hell in the sweet by and by. I'm talking about heaven and hell right here on earth. I've experienced glimpses and moments of heaven, periods of time in heaven, and I've experienced periods of time in hell. I've never been in a war. I feel like the men and women who've been in wars know what real hell is like. So when I say in hell, I need to keep it in perspective. But I have had enough hell in my life to know something about heaven and hell. And who God is, when we say, does God exist, it depends on what kind of God we're talking about. Who is the God we're talking about? And is there any relationship between this God and heaven and hell? So a personal testimony has to do with thinking as well as experience. And I'm talking about the existence of God, heaven and hell, a personal testimony. Now, I am 72 years old. I was born in 1942. My folks were from rural Tennessee. They were very, very intelligent people. They both went to little schools in Tennessee, and then they graduated and they got master's degrees, and my dad took a national exam, entered into California Institute of Technology, where he got a master's in meteorology and worked his whole life as a scientist, working for the United States Weather Bureau, forecasting the weather. And they were raised in the Depression, where life was hard. And we first lived in Alexandria, Virginia for 10 years, then we moved to Kansas. And I don't know what their childhood was like very much, because we never talked about personal matters when I was a child, practically never. Basically, my childhood was very, very difficult. And part of that was my temperament. I was born real stubborn, strong-willed, and hard, very stubborn, and hard to control, and but at the same time, very sensitive. And so I had a lot of really hard things happen to me when I was a child. I remember very, very early feeling like my parents were talking evil against me. And they would put me to bed at night, and I would get up and sneak to the head of the stairs and listen to see what evil things they were saying about me. But I was never able to hear well enough to know. Or at night, a lot of times these evil things would come around my bed and say evil things to me and get close to me and try to hurt me, and I would lash out at them, and I'd sit up in bed and lash out at them, and they would shrink back, and I could never hit them. I had a lot of trouble sleeping. I don't know why I had trouble sleeping, but about 17 months after I was born, my brother Jack was born. And when we got a little older, we'd have trouble sleeping. I remember we'd lie there and we'd sing. And the singing together helped me go to sleep a little bit. I remember my favorite song at all times was Home on the Range. Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where never is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. We'd sing that over and over, and then finally we would go to sleep. I think, thinking about it, the worst thing that happened to me as a child is I gradually became convinced that my mother didn't love me. And this was a very painful experience for me, and I agonized about it for years. And there were a sequence of events that caused me or brought me to that conclusion. I remember one of them in particular. I remember my brother and I was probably about 7 and my brother was about 6. We were in the bathroom one day, and my brother had a bottle of medicine, and he dropped it on the floor, and it splattered in all directions. And just at that second, my mother came through the door, just as the bottle hit the floor. She didn't know who hit it. She couldn't have known because she didn't get there in time. But it splattered, and immediately she stepped in the room and blasted me across the face. And I said, I didn't do it. She said, oh, and just turned around and walked out and never did anything about it or said anything about it. Well, there were a series of those kinds of events. And finally, when I was about 8 or 9, I confronted her. Like I said earlier, I don't remember ever having any serious personal conversations about anything in my family. Basically, the way my family was run was that Dad was the boss and we did what he said. And basically what we did, we just worked. We just worked real hard. When my granddaddy Palmer died, we were downstairs painting chairs. When my little brother Richard, 1949, 7 years after I was born, was brought home from the hospital, we were in the house snapping beans. So that's kind of the way life was. And so I came to Mom one time when I was like about 9 or 8 or 9. I said, Mom, look what's happened, this, and this. And it took me a long time to get up the courage to talk to her. And she just says, oh, Rob, as if what I was saying was complete foolishness. And so I never brought it up again. Looking back on it, I can remember 2 times where I experienced a little bit of a love or affection from my parents. One time I was standing at a puddle of water and I reached up to turn on a light, and electric current started going through me, and I was, shaking from the current, and my dad saw that I was being shocked by the current. He grabbed me, we were in the basement, he carried me upstairs and he handed me to my mom, and I sat on her lap for probably, 20 or 30 minutes. And then one time when I was about 13, my dad told me he had to go somewhere, and he said, I'll be back tonight, you stay up and wait for me. And I said, okay. So he came back later than intended, and I was waiting up for him. I was kind of lying on the floor by the door, and he opened the door and saw me there waiting up for him, and then I stood up and he gave me a hug. Other than that, I have no memory of any love or an affection from my parents. I remember getting spanked, and I remember being slapped, and a lot of that. I remember somewhere along the line when I was 6 or 7, I started getting really afraid of being spanked and switched. I don't know why I wasn't afraid of it before. I must have been. I can't imagine that I wasn't afraid of being spanked. I just remember being down in the basement, maybe when I was like 5 or 6 or something like that, and I'd done something wrong, and Daddy went up the stairs and out into the front yard, and I could see through the basement window there, which was right underneath the basement ceiling. There was a bush out there, and I could see him out there. He was cutting a switch, and he came back in and switched me. And that was a bad moment, because somewhere along in there I just got pretty fearful. I cut up a lot in school, but somewhere along the line, like around 7 or 8, I quit misbehaving. And this thing that I eventually called the plate glass feeling sort of descended upon me. I felt like I was surrounded by a plate of glass. I could see through the glass, but I couldn't experience the things that were on the other side of the glass. It was like I was kind of like encased. And I'm not sure when that started, probably somewhere around 8 or 9. And I became aware of it more and more as time went on, and somewhere around maybe 14 or 15, or maybe even later, I noticed that I had it, and I basically just called it a plate glass feeling. Also, when I was little, I was really strong. I could beat up a lot of kids my age, and but for some reason, in the third, like around the third or the fourth grade, I began to lose my strength. I was no longer as physically as strong as I used to be. I was also fascinated with war and violence. When the Korean War broke out in 1949, I used to follow it in the newspapers every day, what was going on. I remember in the 8th grade, I wrote a report on Genghis Khan. So I was always fascinated by violence and war. I remember going down to Tennessee and seeing pictures from World War II and seeing a soldier washed up on the beach somewhere in the Pacific, and the water had made him absolutely clean. I saw a clean little hole right there in his hip where he'd obviously been shot. I had some really beautiful things happen too. I remember lying out on the ground looking up at the sky, how just feeling very peaceful looking at the sky. I remember having some really good times with my brother. When my dad went in his home, we didn't have to work a whole lot when we were little. When we moved to Kansas, we really had to work all the time. But when I was real little, I had some time to play, although we were working. I remember I was washing the kitchen floor by the time probably I was 4 anyway. I remember making soap and cutting my my knuckles when we were scraping off the little shavings of the soap. But my brother and I, we had some good times playing. I remember we had this fantasy about a guy named Nelson Gray who lived about 2 blocks away, and we made up a bunch of dust. We took bricks and rubbed them on the hard, dry ground and made dust and put them in jars. And our strategy was, when Nelson Gray attacked us, we were going to take our dust and throw dust at him, and he wouldn't be able to see. And we were going to operate like an octopus with a cloud of dust, except they use ink, and we would escape in the dust. So we made up a whole bunch of this stuff, and Nelson Gray never came over. He never ever came over. I think he was half of a fantasy or something. I think I knew there was a Nelson Gray. We just never had any dealings with him. We heard he was mean, but we hardly ever had any dealings with him. But anyway, so we made up about 10 quarts of this stuff, and we didn't know what to do with it. So finally one day, we were living in a row house. We just took handfuls of it and started throwing it down the basement steps of the people who lived next door. And the blobs of dust would descend down the steps, and 80% of it would be lost in the air, but about 15 or 20 or 30% of it would hit the ground there at the bottom of the steps. And it was a hot summer day. People didn't have air conditioning in those days, and it was cooler down in the basement steps. I remember seeing the dust going through her basement screen. Anyway, years later, I said that I could see the dust coming out of the downstairs windows, which I really don't think I ever saw the dust coming out of the downstairs windows, or the first floor windows rather. But anyway, after about 20 minutes of the dust bombing, out she came. The lady who lived next door, she smashed all our bottles and threw them down our basement stairs. And I remember we ran down the basement to get away from her, and then she threw them down. I remember standing down there, or being down there in the basement hiding, and the whole basement was filled up with dust. Anyway, Jack and I had some great times. My brother was named Jack. We did a lot of fun and crazy things. I would tell you about them, but we would be here forever if I would tell you about these things. But of all the things that happened, of all the things, the really great things, the great thing was that every summer, my mom and my dad and my brother and I, we would drive to Tennessee. It's about a 2-day drive. And first we'd visit my mom's folks, and then we'd visit my dad's folks, or maybe vice versa. Now, my mom had a lot of brothers and sisters. There were, I think, 6 in that family, and a bunch of cousins would be there, and they'd all get together. And when we got there, we had no work, and we were utterly free. And I became, and Jack as well, we became intensely happy. Just played full blast all day long. Went down to the creek, except we didn't call it creek, we call it the branch. And caught crawdads and tried to catch the fish, and climbed trees and went swimming, and went to the barn and climbed in the hay and played Piggy Wants a Signal at night, or Red Rover, won't you come over? And I'd lie in the grass and look at the stars. And my mama seemed happy. And even my dad seemed pretty peaceful. It was just wonderful. And I can remember one time we left and we just were crying so hard. And I remember Mom said to Dad, "Wonder why those boys are crying so hard." And part of the reason we were crying so hard is that our life was a grind. And I remember one time we went over to my daddy's house, over my grandmother on my daddy's side. And we used to listen on Saturday nights. I loved it. We'd listen to WSM out of Nashville. And my mom's folks lived on farms outside Lebanon, Tennessee, and my dad's folks lived on farms outside Chevyville. And we listened to WSM, and I thought that program was wonderful. Grand Ole Opry, Saturday night, Grand Ole Opry. And they had Minnie Pearl on there and some other folks, and they were telling jokes. And I remember one joke was that Uncle Nabob, I think his name, said, "Well, I tried out my new spring pants." "Well, how'd it work, Uncle Nabob?" "Well, I was up on the barn. They worked just fine." "You mean you fell off? Did you get hurt?" "No, I didn't get hurt. It was my new spring pants." I thought that was so funny. Anyway, I heard a song one night listening to WSM, which really kind of summed up my childhood in Alexandria, Virginia. And I think it was by Hank Snow, and I don't think I heard it but once, but I never forgot it. I'd sing it to you now, but I can't sing as well as I used to. I'll give it a shot. It goes like this. "I had a home one time, I left it all behind, and I go back home if I could clear my mind. Crying, crying all of the time. I've got a broken heart, I got a tangled mind." That's kind of the way I felt. I remember I used to go off and sing that song to myself, and I would just cry. I'd sing that song, and I'd just cry. Then finally, when I was 10, we moved to Kansas. And for some reason, things in Kansas got better. I'm not sure why. We had a little farm, and my dad was working in for the Weather Bureau in Kansas City. We lived 10 miles out of Kansas City, and he commuted every day. And he put us, the work just really cranked up in Kansas. We worked relentlessly. I remember my aunt told me one time, she said, "I never saw little boys work as hard as you little boys did." So all we did pretty much was work. We had no social life. I have hardly any memories of my parents ever having anybody over for dinner or anything like that. Maybe, I remember one occasion or maybe two, or wait, maybe three, almost never. All we did was work. They were from rural Tennessee. They didn't fit in with that sort of suburban life that we had there in Kansas. We just did our own thing, basically. Back when I was about 7, when we were down in Tennessee one time, I had a pillow fight. We were having this big pillow fight. It was great. And I was pounding my brother Jack, and I had a pillow, and I was about to whack him up against the wall. And I looked at him, and all of a sudden he had this scared look on his face. Well, you know, you can't hurt somebody much when you hit him with a pillow. But he was only about 6, and I was stronger and bigger. But he had this frightened look on his face, and I stopped, and I didn't hit him. And I remember making a decision, I'm not going to hit him ever again. And for some reason, I was always kind of tender-hearted. I remember when I was about 7, we saw a movie at school called Heidi. And in the movie, Heidi got lost on the mountain. And back in those days, it was all pretty primitive. This would have been 1947. So right in the middle when Heidi was lost on the mountain, I got so stricken with this, I started crying. And then they turned on the lights and changed the reel. And I was sobbing, and all the kids were looking at me. And I know I had that plate glass feeling, but even so, I could still feel things for broken-hearted people, or for just brokenness or hurt of any kind. I don't know why. I remember one time one of my brothers got hurt, and I can't remember who it was or exactly what happened, but I was on the front porch. I saw it happen. My mother was there. So as soon as it happened, I found myself about to burst into tears. I was about 12 then. I ran into the back of the house so nobody could see me, tears bursting from my eyes, and I ran right into the kitchen, and there was another one of my brothers. I have 3 younger brothers. Saw me crying like that. So I was always kind of tender-hearted in spite of my plate glass feeling and my sense of isolation. And I left out the fact that when I was about 8, I just entered into this intense fantasy life that just went on and on. And also I had trouble learning how to read. But once I learned how to read, I began to read ferociously. And this is one of the first books I ever really liked a lot. It's called The Musicians of Bremen. This is not the original copy, but it's about these 4 animals, the dog, the cat, the donkey, and the rooster, who were rejected by their masters one by one, and they join together and they go off alone into this dark woods. They're lost and rejected by the world. And there they hear a light and sounds, and they creep up to see what the light is about. And they see some robbers inside this well-lit house counting their gold. And they watch through the windows, and then the robbers go to bed, and they slip in. And the cat scratches and meows, and the rooster crows and kicks, and the donkey kicks and brays, and the dog howls and bites, and the robbers run out of the house, leaving him there, and they live happily ever after. Well, I love that story. Anyway, I hit my brother I was going to hit him against the wall, and I didn't do it. So I promised myself, somewhere along in there, I promised myself I'll never hit him again, or I'll never tell on him again, and I never did. So when we got to Kansas, the work just got brutal. We just worked continuously. Dad had shift work. They had forecasting as around-the-clock activities. So sometimes he'd work from 8 to 4, and sometimes he'd be on a shift from 4 to 12, or at night, or from midnight to 8. But when he was gone, he made sure we had plenty of work to do. And so my brother and I, we just kind of went into cahoots against him. Just decided all we were going to do is just do what he told us to do. By then our spirits were completely crushed. When I was 16, I read several of Freud's works, and decided that my dad had crushed my spirit by the time I was probably 12 or 13, just from spankings and switchings and being slapped by my mom and things like that, and the hard work and the lack of affection. And don't ever remember being told I was loved by either one of my parents, except when I got older and went off to college. I remember a couple times my mom told me she loved me as I was leaving. But anyway, we went into cahoots against Dad, and basically a Cold War erupted, which lasted the rest of my childhood. And he'd leave to go to work, and he'd leave us with plenty of work to do, and then we would rush like gangbusters to get it done. We would get it done in half the time it would normally take when he and I and Jack together worked, and then we would play. We had a wonderful time playing. Anyway, we had a little farm, but in the morning we'd get up, and one of us would milk the cow, muck out the stable, get the feed. The other one would go down to the chicken house, get the water and the feed for the chickens, and then we'd alternate on a weekly basis. But life was tough out there. We hardly had any friends. We had to come home immediately after school. Never had any money to speak of. No social life. We went to my dad was Presbyterian and my mom was Church of Christ. And in Church of Christ, they told you on a regular basis you were going to go to hell. So when I was about 13, I was sitting there listening to a hellfire and damnation sermon, and my brother was sitting next to me, and he started to get up to go down the aisle to get saved. And I realized that I better get down there too. It was going to look bad if I didn't go down there too to get saved. So I went down there and got saved, and I got saved. But I tried real hard for about 3 or 4 months to lead a Christian life. I let other kids run over me and everything like that. Turn the other cheek like you're supposed to. And finally, after about 3 or 4 months, I started looking forward to the day when I didn't care about being a Christian anymore. And finally, that day began to come, which was a great relief to me, frankly. In fact, when I'd go to church, I'd come home with a headache almost every Sunday. It was a bleak experience. I like some of the songs, though. What a Friend We Have in Jesus, and Just As I Am, and My Jesus, I Love You, and The Old Rugged Cross. Those songs had some tenderness and some goodness and some beauty about them. Anyway, when I was about 13, I started coming out of my fantasy world. I had by then, without really knowing about it, I basically had given up on being loved. It's not like I said I'm giving up on being loved. I just had kind of given up on it. And without being aware of it, I became interested in something else, namely truth. And that's why I'm giving this talk on the existence of God, because by truth, I meant, what is real? What's going on? Why are things happening? What are people really thinking and feeling? What is going on in other countries? What's happening when certain people do certain things? That's truth. What is the world really like? I got very interested in that and kind of began to go in that direction. Just begin to read. I had trouble learning to read. My brother Jack learned to read the same time I did. I learned to read when I was 6. My mother taught me how, and I sat down on one side of Mom and Jack sat on the other, and we learned how to read. And Jack is one of these genius people that has a super high IQ, and he read David Copperfield or something like that by the time he was in the 1st grade, and highest national merit scores in the school, and one of the top in the states, and in the state, and just a genius. He could memorize things in an instant. Always took place in the 1st place in all the Latin tests, and on and on. But anyway, and my mom used to say about him, still waters run deep. And every time she said it, it would hurt my feelings because he never talked much. He didn't say anything. In fact, he and I never talked. We'd talk a little bit, but we didn't talk much. We just knew we were together, and we knew who the enemy was. And I remember one time we were down in the basement knocking out a wall because the old wall had a crack in it, and there was a leak when it rained. And I guess I was about 15 or 16 by that time, and going to the church, and they'd talk about Genesis 1, and I would notice there that God created light on the 1st day, but the sun and the moon didn't come along until like about the 5th day. And I thought, well, how is that possible? Anyway, I had a number of questions that I would ask. I asked the teacher several questions and never got any kind of answer. And finally, after a while, I just began to think that they didn't have the answers. And so I remember I began to suspect that there wasn't any God. That seemed logical to me. Just because a particular book says God exists does not mean God exists. So I remember we were down in the basement knocking out a wall. I said to Jack, what's going to happen if we quit believing in God? Jack says, well, I don't think it's going to be a problem, because if we don't believe in God, for all practical purposes, God doesn't exist. Which I thought was kind of a strange answer. I don't know, kind of a puzzling answer. And later I sort of realized it had sort of an assumption, and the assumption was that if you don't believe it, that God doesn't do anything, doesn't ever speak, act, or appear, makes no difference in matters of fact. So if you don't think he exists, the world's no different as far as God doing anything, whether you think he exists or whether you don't think he exists. The only difference is that you think he exists. So anyway, I got to thinking about these things. I read Freud several books about Freud, Totem and Taboo, Interpretation of Dreams, Interpretation of Errors, when I was about 16. And I got put in the accelerated classes and got in with these intellectuals in the high school, kind of a big high school. We lived in Marion, Kansas, and I went to Shawnee Mission North High School. Probably had about 500 kids in my class, and had this group of intellectuals. And this conversation got going over free will versus determinism. And I was kind of on the periphery of it, but I was very interested in that topic. And this is what I mean about truth. Are we free? Is it true that we're free, or are we determined? And the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that the issue could never be decided. I couldn't imagine any sequence of experiences or tests or anything that could convincingly show whether you had free will or whether you didn't. And so the more I thought about it, I decided that what the approach that I would take would be that things are pretty much the way they appear. For example, I can speak English really well. I also speak Spanish, but I don't speak Spanish as well as I speak English, because I never heard any Spanish until I was 35 years old, at least, and maybe a little more older. And so I'm determined to be a good or pretty good English speaker. I'm determined to see the sun if I go outside tomorrow, or at least the sky, because that's just the nature of things. I'm determined to be a male by something that happened in the womb. So in a sense, I'm partially determined. But on the other hand, I experience myself as having a degree of freedom. I do unexpected things. Like making this video is a little bit of an unexpected thing. I hadn't quite planned on doing this. It's an unexpected thing. And so I decided that there was no scientific sequence of experiments that could prove free will versus determinism either way. There's a lot more that could be said on this subject that I'm not saying right here, but just talking about adolescent reflections. I decided that I was partially determined and partially free. And I also decided that the only real things are the things that can be experienced. And since I had never met anybody that had experienced God, or never met anybody that had God talk to them. I'd met a lot of people that read about God in a book, but never had God really talk to them, or never seen God, or witnessed a miracle, or been impacted by God in any way. It seemed to me, for all practical purposes, that God did not exist. In fact, I thought it was really kind of weird that people would actually pray to God, because the people in the Church of Christ believed that the age of miracles were over, that Jesus was no longer raising the dead and casting out demons and all those kinds of things, quote unquote, kinds of things, if he actually did them, because I began to have my doubts about that. But it seemed to me that they said that he quit doing those things. And I thought to myself, well, why are they praying? They say prayers, but why do they pray? I mean, what's the difference between praying that your child will be happy and praying that your child will get healed from a serious illness? If he can do one, he can do the other. That just seemed obvious to me. Well, they didn't believe that God did any miracles anymore, so to me, logically, they shouldn't have believed that there was no point even in praying. I didn't understand the whole thing.